Russian President Vladimir Putin has claimed that Western weapons delivered to Ukraine have ended up in the hands of Hamas and other terror groups in the Middle East. Russian television has been quick to exploit the Israeli-Hamas conflict for propaganda purposes.
For Russian state media, the conflict in the Middle East has become the latest site for its ongoing propaganda war against the West and the U.S. One main claim, the U.S. is a warmonger, both in Israel and in Ukraine.
America is at war with everyone.
On Russian state TV, including on the show of prominent pro-Kremlin host Vladimir Solovyov on the channel Russia 1, the two conflicts are presented as two sides of the same coin.
These people don't have any moral authority. None at all.
On several occasions, Russian President Vladimir Putin has claimed that Western weapons deliveries to Ukraine have ended up in the hands of Hamas and other groups in the Middle East.
Everyone knows that the level of corruption in Ukraine is very high. The black market means that there are a lot of people who want to buy these weapons, and in Ukraine there are a lot of people looking to sell. They say that weapons from Ukraine are turning up in the Middle East, they are selling them to the Taliban, and then they are being passed on. Everything can be bought and sold.
The Ukrainian side rejects these claims. Ukraine's head of defense intelligence told the Ukrainian newspaper Ukrainska Pravda that it's Russia arming Hamas with weapons seized on the battlefield in Ukraine.
The Russian involvement here is obvious. We know precisely that for a long time trophy weapons have been passed on.
Back on Russian state TV, the divisive conflict in Israel is being used to show the U.S. as isolated on the world stage. Dmitry Kiselyov, often known as Putin's chief propagandist, could hardly hide his delight at a recent vote on a pause in fighting in the UN General Assembly.
The U.S. turned out to be nearly fully isolated. The word isolation is usually the one Washington likes to use in relation to Russia. They fell into a ditch that they were digging for others. The US has never sunk into such humiliating levels in the UN before. But this is just a reflection of how the world has started to perceive the US. The changes are radical.
For Russia, the war in Israel is just the latest chance to claim that the US's dominance on the international stage is ending.
Well, joining me now is Marina Marone. She is a military analyst and a research fellow at the Defense Studies Department at King's College, London. Marina, it's good to see you on this Friday. We just saw that report about the propaganda machine in Russia. What do you think the Kremlin strategy is in this conflict between Hamas and Israel?
Good evening, Brent. Well, apart from the fact that Russia is obviously using its position in order to spread certain messages which are not confirmed, so we can call them disinformation. Russia's overall strategy is to become a peace broker in this conflict. This conflict in Gaza is benefiting Russia from many sides, especially because it's diverting attention away from Ukraine, and now the whole focus is on Israel and Gaza. So Russia is trying to reinforce these claims, depicting the United States in a bad light, as we have seen before. And Russia is also having an open ear for both sides, for both Israel and Hamas, in order to emerge as a peace broker here, in order to show that whatever the United States couldn't achieve in the Middle East, here is Russia who can achieve peace in the Middle East.
Ukraine is accusing Russia of supplying Hamas with weapons. Is there evidence of that? And where does it get all of its weapons?
Well, first of all, we have heard Kirill Budanov, who is the head of the Ukrainian military intelligence, saying that Russia has been supplying Hamas with weapons. These claims have not been confirmed. We have to also understand that Ukraine is using the information space to its advantage. That being said, where does Hamas get its weapons? It is a good question, because Gaza is blocked. It's being overseen by the Israeli intelligence, by the Egyptian intelligence, as well as by the Saudi intelligence. Now, We know that Hamas has been getting its weapons from Iran, so most of its weapons are coming from Iran. Now, we could possibly extrapolate, thinking perhaps Russia could have sent weapons to Iran, which could have ended up with Hamas. However, there is no confirmation. And many of the weapons are being manufactured locally, at least according to Hamas's own statements. And other weapons, such as missiles, have apparently been delivered by Iran through the sea route because of the geographical position of Gaza.
Marini, I don't have to tell you, the attention of the international community has shifted from the Ukraine war to the conflict in the Middle East. Western countries are now pledging military aid to Israel as well. How do you think all of this is going to play out for the situation in Ukraine?
Well, it's very complicated because at the moment, and we know Ukraine needs artillery shells, 155 millimeter artillery shells. And the U.S. pledged to give 10,000 of those shells to Israel. U.S. has also said that it will be able to support both Ukraine and Israel. That being said, we have to think realistically about the problems with the global supply chain and with the manufacturing times of such ammunition. The NATO countries are already in shortage of those. Therefore, despite the political statements that we're hearing, I think the situation will be difficult for Ukraine because the United States will not be able to keep this up. Also considering the political situation, the volatility of the political situation in the United States and the fact that it has been the biggest supporter of Ukraine in military terms.
Marina Marone from King's College London. As always, Marina, we appreciate your time and your insights. Thank you.
Thank you very much for having me.
Well, that report from Emily Sherwin, who joins us now from the Latvian capital Riga, where our Moscow bureau has been based since Russia banned DW from the country. Welcome, Emily. You mentioned in your reports that some of the narratives the Russian state propaganda has been using when reporting on the Israel-Hamas conflict. Are these ideas new to the Russian public?
Well, yes and no, Phil. So the anti-U.S. rhetoric that we're hearing now isn't new. That's something that we've been hearing for years and years from the Russian side, including on the conflict in Ukraine. They present Ukraine as basically being, a puppet of the U.S. And now there's a strong implication that the U.S. is kind of pulling the strings fully behind the scenes when it comes to Israel as well. So that anti-Western and anti-U.S. rhetoric in particular isn't new. What is new is kind of the view on the Middle East, because before the war and before this newest outbreak of the conflict in the Middle East, we had kind of Russia almost performing a balancing act. They held talks regularly in Moscow with Hamas, who they don't consider a terrorist group. They also had very close ties with Israel, including because, there's a lot of Russian-speaking Israelis living in the country. Putin would meet regularly with Netanyahu. But now, after October 7th, after these, Hamas terror attacks on Israel, basically Putin took 10 days to even call Netanyahu. So that's kind of, you can see that as a diplomatic snub. So we're seeing kind of Russia aligning itself a bit more with the Palestinians, talking a lot about Palestinian suffering and condemning the actions of Israel. And that is new.
Right. And is the Russian propaganda working? Is the Russian public believing these ideas?
Well, as I mentioned, the anti-U.S. narrative, I think that works. I saw that in my years of reporting in Moscow. That's a very strong narrative that we've been hearing for years. And there are two more things, I think, that I would mention when it comes to the propaganda. One thing is that these shows that you see, they're very emotional. They're kind of very visceral. Even the language that's used, we heard in that report, the presenter talking about digging ditches and, people shout often on these programs. So it's kind of an attempt to grab the viewer and really pull them in. And the other thing is that we have all these different narratives being kind of thrown into a pot and the presenters just sort of stirring around. So you have, on the one hand, the Ukraine conflict, then then the conflict in the Middle East, all being thrown into one mention of a migration crisis, anti-Semitism, the problems in the West. They're all just kind of being thrown into one bowl, as I said, and that's kind of creates confusion for the viewer. And I think that's the point, because for a domestic audience, of course, if you're watching this, you think, oh, I don't really understand geopolitics. Oh, well, I'll let Putin and the government deal with this, and I won't be involved. I won't get politically involved or engaged, which, of course, in a dictatorship like Russia, I think is the point.
Thanks for that, Emily. Emily Sherwin in Riga.